Well, good morning, everybody. Great to have you guys here today on this beautiful summer day in January. And let me give a big shout out to those of you who are joining us right now with church online, watching from living rooms and coffee shops and college dormitories, wherever you happen to be. Great to have you guys with us as well. For those who are here in the room at our Dixon City campus, let's make them feel welcome as a part of the service today. Today we're continuing this teaching series called How Not to Be Your Own Worst Enemy. Because here's the truth about us. Every single one of us has the potential to become our own worst enemy. And I know that's true in my life. I know that my worst enemy is pretty much the guy I see every morning when I look in the mirror. That if I were to honestly assess my life and look back over my life and identify some of the biggest challenges I've had in my life, I would have to say that most of them have been created through my own choices, my own decisions. I mean, any of us can become our own worst enemy. In fact, let me tell you about a time in my life when I unintentionally became my own worst enemy. This goes back years ago when Debbie and I bought our first house. Our first house was a fixer-upper. I mean, like a serious capital F, capital U, fixer-upper, including the outside. It was very, very overgrown. And so one day I was outside on the property and I noticed this beautiful oak tree that had a vine about 2 inches thick that was just wrapping around it. And I could tell that this vine was beginning to do some damage to the tree, so I thought, you know what, I better get rid of that thing. So I grabbed my chainsaw, and I started cutting it in pieces and pulling more of it down and cutting it up. And then I threw it in a burn barrel, and I burned it. Now, some of you know what this is because you recognize the picture. Some of you know what this is because you've heard me tell the story before. But I did not know what that vine was. Turns out that that vine was a very mature poison ivy plant that had been growing for years and gradually encapsulating that tree. But here's the problem. I don't know if you know this or not. When you burn poison ivy, the smoke carries the poison ivy oil and it covers everything it touches, your skin, your clothes, whatever it might be. So if you're into essential oils, it'd be like getting poison ivy oil and putting it in your diffuser next to your bed before you go to sleep at night. So this is basically what I did to myself. So a couple of days later, I wake up and I'm just covered head to toe with a rash. I mean, even inside my nostrils. Seriously. So I was on steroids. I was using creams. I literally did not leave my house for a week. Do you know whose fault that was? Mine. I became my own worst enemy. And you know what? That's a picture of life. So many times we make choices, we make decisions, we put ourselves in circumstances where we create pain and discomfort for ourselves. We can all become our own worst enemy. So during this series, what we're doing is we're identifying 4 habits, 4 preemptive habits, that if we can establish these habits in our lives, we'll have a very good chance of never becoming our own worst enemy. And by the way, it's not just about us, because whenever we become our own worst enemy, that affects other people, doesn't it? It has a ripple effect to the people around us. You know, when you blow up your own life, the shrapnel of that affects the people that you love, the people that you know, the people that you depend on. And so there's something at stake even beyond our own well-being in this. And so these 4 habits, we began just by way of review last week by talking about this first habit, which is think long term. And we talked last week about the fact that one of the ways we become our own worst enemy is by thinking short term, by making decisions only in light of the current circumstances and emotions and not considering the long-term ripple effects of those decisions. And then we talked about this strategy, this 10-10-10 strategy last week, where you look at every decision you're about to make in terms of how it will feel, what the implications will be in 10 minutes, in 10 months, and most importantly, in 10 years. And so if you missed last week, you can always go back online and catch up. But this week, we're going to talk about this second habit that can help us avoid becoming our own worst enemy. And it is simply this: listen to wise counsel. Listen to wise counsel. Because if you're in the middle of making a decision, I can almost guarantee you that there's somebody in your life who's connecting dots that you're not connecting, who's seeing things that you're not seeing. Somebody who may even be trying to warn you about the decision you're about to make. And if we are willing to open ourselves up to their input, it can keep us from becoming our own worst enemy. We have to listen to wise counsel. So about 20 years ago, there was a TV game show that became very popular. It was called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You guys remember this? It is basically a series of trivia questions, and if you would get a trivia question correct, you would just keep going up and up and up until you got to the $1 million prize. But if you came to a question where you were stuck, there's three lifelines that you could take advantage of. Do you remember this? There was the 50-50 where they would eliminate all the answers except two. So you had a 50-50 chance of getting it right. And then you could ask the audience, where they would electronically survey the audience to see what they thought the answer would be. But then there was this one. Do you remember what this lifeline was called? If you know, just shout it out. What was this? Yeah, final answer? Yeah. It was phone a friend. And this one, the idea behind this is that you would have someone on standby waiting by their phone. So if you got to a question you couldn't answer, you could call them and they could help you with the answer. Now, the strategy behind that was pretty simple. You wanted to have somebody standing by, waiting by that phone who was smarter than you. Right? Like somebody who is really good at trivia so that when you called them, they would give you the answer that you need. So here's what I want you to think about today. Do you have someone in your life, do you have people in your life that you can pick up the phone and call when you're stuck, when you need answers, when you need direction? Do you have somebody that you can turn to for wisdom in your life? Because I think we all need that. Because if we're willing to turn to the right people, and if we are willing to listen to the right voices, we can save ourselves and the people around us a lot of heartache and a lot of pain. Okay? So today, as we talk about this idea of listening to wise counsel, I want to draw your attention to the story of a man in the Bible named Rehoboam. And his story is told in the Jewish scriptures, what we as Christians call the Old Testament, in a book called 1 Kings. And the story of Rehoboam really is a warning to us about the dangers of making decisions without wise counsel or with rejecting wise counsel. And if I could summarize his story in one sentence, this is what we learned from Rehoboam. The right voices can keep us from making the wrong choices. The right voices, if we're willing to listen to them, can keep us from making the wrong choices, okay? So let's jump into the story of Rehoboam. But as we do that, let me set the stage for you and tell you a little bit about what was happening in history at this point. So at this point in time, the nation of Israel was led by a series of kings. And the very first king was a man named Saul, and he led the nation for 22 years. He was followed by David. David, as you may know, was this teenager who killed a giant named Goliath, and that put him on a path to leadership. He led the nation of Israel for 40 years, arguably the greatest king that the people of Israel had ever seen. And then David was followed by Solomon, who is described in the Bible as the wisest man who ever lived. And so the reign of David and the reign of Solomon, those 80 years, that was like the golden age for the nation of Israel. But then Solomon had passed away, and so now his son, Rehoboam, was next in line to lead the nation of Israel. He would be the fourth king of Israel. And that's where we pick up the story. 1 Kings 12, verse 1. It says this: Rehoboam went to Shechem, and Shechem was a city north of Jerusalem, which in ancient Israel was actually the capital city of Israel at the time. So Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. Okay, so this is like the greatest day of his life. Rehoboam was given this amazing leadership opportunity. He was given the privilege of leading God's people, the nation of Israel, into the future, to build on the legacy of David and Solomon. So he becomes king, and almost immediately he has to make a decision, and he makes a decision that has a ripple effect not only for his life but for the entire nation, and literally changes the course of history in a negative way. So here's what happens. Skip ahead, verse 3. The whole assembly of Israel, and the assembly of Israel would be the key leaders representing the people. The whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, and they're speaking now on behalf of all the people. They said to him, your father, and that would be Solomon, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. A little bit of background here. So Solomon, the previous king, Under his leadership, the nation of Israel had grown much stronger and much wealthier. And so Solomon went on this process of all of these building projects, all these construction projects throughout Israel, building palaces and a beautiful temple that he built in Jerusalem. And to be honest, these building projects were probably as much about his name and his legacy and his glory as anything else. But Solomon actually conscripted thousands of Jewish men to do the labor that was required. And they would have to work for long days, physical labor, year after year after year. And so Solomon dies, and Rehoboam, his son, becomes the next king. And the people come to him and they say, listen, we will happily serve you, but you've got to lighten the load. You've got to dial back on these building projects. You've got to just be reasonable with us. And so Rehoboam comes up against the first decision that he's got to make as a leader. And right off the bat, he does two very good things. So the first very good thing he does is this. Rehoboam answered, go away for 3 days and then come back to me, which was a good idea, because when you're making a decision, you always want to take time to think about it. He says, listen, I want to think carefully about this, so give me a few days, and then we'll get back together, and I'll give you my decision. So the people went away. And then Rehoboam makes a second very good decision. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. And so Rehoboam turns for advice to probably the best people he could have turned to. These guys are older, they're wiser, they've got leadership experience, they've been around for a while, they understand the DNA of the nation and of leadership. They were the very best people that he could have turned to for advice. And so he says, how would you advise me to answer these people? And here's what they said. They replied, if today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. So the elders say, listen, Rehoboam, as you begin your reign as king, if you will lead as a servant leader, if you will listen to the people, if you will care about them, if you will show compassion toward them, they will always be loyal to you. I mean, great advice. But here's what happens next, verse 8. But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him. Do you know why he rejected the advice the elders gave him? Because it was what he needed to hear, but it was not what he wanted to hear. And so do you know what he did? He did what we all do. When somebody gives us advice that we need to hear but we don't want to hear, we find someone else who will give us advice and tell us what we want to hear. And that's what he did. But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. The young men who had grown up with him. In other words, they had no more life experience than he did. They had no more insight than he did. They had no more leadership expertise than he did. They were just the guys he had grown up with. And then it says they were serving him. In other words, they worked in the kingdom. They worked for Rehoboam. And so I'm guessing, and if you've ever been in a position when you're under somebody's authority and your paycheck depends on them, I'm guessing they did not want to risk their job security by telling Rehoboam something he didn't want to hear. And so what you do in that situation is you figure out what that person wants to hear, and you tell them what they want to hear, because you want to stay on their good side, because your job security might be at stake, okay? Now, let me tell you how to become your own worst enemy. It's real simple. If you want to become your own worst enemy, just surround yourself with people who always tell you what you want to hear. If you want to blow up your family, you want to blow up your finances, you want to blow up your future, it's really simple. Just surround yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear. And listen, we can always find people who will tell us what we want to hear, right? I see this all the time in counseling. People will go to counseling for themselves, for their marriage, whatever, and they'll get to a point where the counselor will say something that they don't want to do, and so they say, you know what, that counselor just didn't fit. Try this other one over here. You know, we look for people who tell us what we want to hear. Let me ask you to wrestle with a question right now before we jump back into the story of Rehoboam. Here's the question. Whose advice are you ignoring right now? Now, it might be bad advice. You might need to ignore some advice, but I want you to wrestle with that question. Let that sink in. Whose advice are you ignoring right now? All right, let's pick up the story. He asked them, and this would be the young men he had grown up with, the guys who worked for him. He asked them, what is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, lighten the yoke your father put on us? What do you guys think? Verse 10. The young man who had grown up with him replied, these people have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. Tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Which is kind of a phrase in their culture that meant, you think he was tough? Wait till you get to know me. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. In other words, you ain't seen nothing yet. If you don't follow my leadership, you're going to long for the days of Solomon. Okay, so these guys get together, right, and the testosterone is flowing, and the swagger is showing, and they're saying, Rehoboam, you got to show these guys who's the boss around here. You got to exert your authority as the king. You got to put the hammer down. So he listens to them. A few days later, all the people reassemble again because he said, give me 3 days, then I'll give you my decision. And so all the people get back together again. Here's what happens, verse 13. The king answered the people harshly. Listen to this. Rejecting the advice given him by the elders, he followed the advice of the young men and said, my father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people. And at that moment, when he rejected the advice of the elders, at that moment, when he made that decision and announced it, his fate was sealed and the fate of the nation was sealed. Because listen to how the people respond. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, what share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? And here's what they're saying, because Rehoboam was the grandson of David. He was of the house of David, the lineage of David. And so they're saying, what share do we have in your household, in your kingdom? We don't really want any part of you anymore. And then they say, to your tents, Israel, and then look after your own house, David, speaking to Rehoboam, David's grandson. In other words, this was their way of saying, look, Rehoboam, you can go build your own blankety-blank palaces and cities, because we're tired of this, and we're going home, and we don't even recognize you as king anymore. So here's what happens, verse 17. So the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. Now, let me explain what happened at this moment. At this point, the nation of Israel was divided into two separate kingdoms that became known as the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The nation of Israel was made up of 12 tribes. 10 of those 12 tribes rebelled against Judah, and they established their own kingdom, which kept the name Israel. It had its own capital. 2 of those 12 tribes stayed loyal to Rehoboam. They became known as Judah. And so now the kingdom was divided. And then Rehoboam, he makes one more really bad decision, because he thinks, oh, you know what, they're going to settle down. They'll get over this. Just an emotional reaction. I can fix this. Here's what happens, verse 18. King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. Didn't go well. And so the nation of Israel, from this point forward for 350 years, was divided into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and it stayed that way for 350 years. And because they were divided, they were weakened as a nation. And as they were weakened, they became vulnerable. And because they were vulnerable, they were invadable. And foreign armies eventually invaded both the northern and southern kingdom, plundered the country, took many of the people captive, all because of one decision made by a king who refused to listen to wise counsel. Now here's the thing. Rehoboam is not alone, is he? Because all of us have had times in our lives when we have chosen to surround ourselves with people who will only tell us what we want to hear. We've all had times in our lives when we've given the stiff hand to wisdom, and we've embraced an opinion that was not wise. Like we've all refused to listen to or rejected wise input and then have suffered the consequences for it. And the question is, why do we do that? Why do we do that? Sometimes time after time after time. Why do we do that? Why do we refuse to listen to wise counsel? I think it comes down to one 5-letter word: pride. It's the attitude that says, I'm smarter, I'm cooler, I'm more sophisticated than your average person. I've got this figured out. I don't need anybody else's input. I've got this. It's pride. So as I was preparing this week, I came across a story about Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, in case you don't remember him, was a famous heavyweight champion boxer. And he had like a really big personality. Like he loved to trash talk his opponents, and he loved to brag about his accomplishments. Very colorful personality. But he was on a plane. He was traveling somewhere just a few days after he had won the World Heavyweight Championship. And the flight attendant came up to him and said, "Excuse me, sir, I have to ask you to buckle your seatbelt." And Muhammad Ali looked up at the flight attendant and he said this. He said, "Superman don't need no seatbelt." Which is totally something he would say, right? Superman don't need no seatbelt. But the flight attendant, who was very quick on her feet, said this: "Superman don't need no airplane either, so buckle up." Which is brilliant if you think about it. Okay, if you're Superman, why are you even on the airplane? All right. But here's the truth about us. We all have areas of our lives where we think, I'm Superman, I got this. I'm fine. And we all know people like this, right? People who are always the smartest person in the room, according to them. People who are quick to give advice but never want to listen to advice. People who are really unteachable. And then the older I get, the more I see this trait, I think, is one of the most damaging ones that you can have. And because if you have a prideful, unteachable attitude, you're gonna find yourself in ditch after ditch, making mistake after mistake, and becoming your own worst enemy over and over. Because when you think you know everything, then you're not willing to turn to God or other people for wisdom. See, let me say it one more time. The right voices can keep us from making the wrong choices. But the reason we don't listen to the right voices is because of our pride, because we think we got it all figured out. So how do you change that? And what's the solution to this? Let me give you a very simple 3-step process, okay? It's just excruciatingly simple, but it begins here. It begins with this: desire wise counsel. Okay, you have to start with a change in attitude, a shift toward humility. You've got to begin by desiring wise counsel, which means saying to yourself, you know what? There is probably a lot I don't know, and if I'm going to thrive in this life, I'm going to need to turn to others who are wiser than I am and welcome their input into my life. See, humility is the bedrock of wisdom. It really is. Even Solomon himself wrote this in Proverbs 21. He said this: "The way of a fool seems right to him, but a wise man listens to advice." A wise man listens to advice. But I love this phrase up here: the way of a fool seems right to him. And here's the thing: what we do seems right to us, doesn't it? Because we wouldn't do it if it didn't seem right to us. But just because something seems right to us does not mean it is right. Because here's the thing: we all have blind spots. We have gaps in our knowledge and wisdom. We can easily slip into self-deception where we think what we're doing is right when it's actually not. In fact, speaking of self-deception, give you another example from a game show that started about 20 years ago called American Idol. And I've always thought American Idol, at least the first part of the season, was a case study in self-deception, right? Or you get people who come in who are thoroughly convinced that they are great singers. And the 3 judges and the millions of people watching on TV know that they are not very good singers. And I've often watched that and thought to myself, I wonder what the parallel to that is in my life. What are the things in my life that I think I'm really good at and I've got it all figured out and I know what I'm doing, but everybody else around me is saying he's such an idiot, you know? The only way to get past our self-deception, the only way to overcome our blind spots is to have an attitude that says, I want and I need wisdom from outside of myself. So it always begins here. Desire wise counsel. Then the second step in the process is this. Then you've got to pursue wise counsel. In other words, we have to be intentional about seeking out people who can be that voice of wisdom in our lives. We've got to be intentional about surrounding ourselves with the right people. Building relationships with people who can offer wisdom to us in our time of need, that person that we have on speed dial when we just need to phone a friend. And let me tell you 4 things you ought to look for in this. Look for someone, first of all, with faith. Someone who has a deep and authentic relationship with God, and it's obvious that as they live their life, they're living their life based on God's wisdom. And you need this because then when you turn to them, they're going to give you an answer. They're going to give you a response that's rooted in the heart of God and that's rooted in His truth, and not just their opinion or what they heard on a talk show that day. You want someone who has a deep faith. Secondly, you want someone with a love for you. They care about you. They care about you enough that they want you to become everything that you can become in God's sight, that they want you every day to become more and more and more like Jesus Himself. In fact, they love you enough that they're willing to say hard things even when they know it might risk the relationship, because they care even more about you than they do about the relationship. That's the kind of friend you want. That's the kind of counselor that you want. Somebody who loves the friend more than the friendship. They love you enough that they'll say what needs to be said, even when it's hard to say, and hopefully they'll do it tactfully. And then objectivity is important. This doesn't mean that you only turn to someone who might be a stranger, but it means you look for wisdom from people who have a certain level of objectivity. Because so many times when we're involved in a decision, especially a difficult one, there's a lot of emotion attached to it. And we can make those decisions based on our emotion because we're so close to it. And we need somebody who can come alongside of us and who can be objective when we're not. One example, let's suppose you're married and you're having some challenges in your marriage. The person to go to for counsel is probably not your mom. Okay? Because moms and dads tend not to be very objective about their little boy or their little girl. Okay? So faith, love, objectivity, and then experience is very helpful as well, depending on what it is you're trying to figure out. So if you just had your first child, you're just beginning this parenting journey, find parents who've raised their kids, and as you look at them, it seems as if they've done a really good job at that, and you sit down with them and you say, listen, tell us what you learned and tell us what we need to know at the very beginning of this parenting journey. Or maybe you're about to get married and you look at somebody who's been married for decades, and this couple, after decades of marriage, they still seem to be very much in love with each other, and you buy them dinner and you say, just tell us what we need to know as we begin this marriage relationship. You find somebody with experience, okay? Faith and love and objectivity and experience. You pursue wise counsel. And then third, not only desire and pursue, but then you receive wise counsel. Even when it's what you need to hear, but not what you want to hear. So when you seek counsel, then you listen to it and you absorb it non-defensively. And you consider it and you think about it and you pray about it and you wrestle with it, okay? You don't just reject it because it's not what you wanted to hear. Now, this isn't about running your life by a committee. I'm not talking about saying yes to everything that somebody else tells you ought to do, because we can't allow our lives to be held captive to other people's opinions all the time. But if you can find people of an authentic faith with authentic love for you, who are objective and who are experienced in this life, and if you can find people like that and surround yourself with them, that is a tremendous gift. That is God's way oftentimes of directing us in life through other people who can speak His wisdom into us. And I'll be honest with you, as I look back over my life, I shudder to think about where I might be today if it weren't for the people that God allowed to cross my path who had wisdom, who directed me. And my only regret is that I didn't listen to them more often than I did. The right voices can keep you from making the wrong choices. So when we open up our lives to the voices of wisdom, we make better decisions, we have fewer regrets, and we don't become our own worst enemy. Now, let me make this very, very practical for you. Because we believe in this idea so much that we've actually structured the life of our church around this. And so we put a lot of time and energy into creating opportunities that are outside of this 1 hour that we spend together on weekends. I love what we do here on weekends. I think it's very, very important what we do in this gathering every week. But I know it's not enough to get us where we need to go spiritually. And so our hope for you, if you're a part of this church, is that you'll move out of a row and into a circle, that you'll move beyond the anonymity of a big group of people like this and find some people that you can do life with. People that can sharpen you, people that can speak wisdom into your life. And we have a number of opportunities for you to try to begin those relationships. And this is the time of year when we encourage people to jump into a group as we begin a new year. And so if you're interested in finding out what the options are, just go to this website, parkerhill.org/groups, or on your way out today, you just stop out in the lobby. You're going to see a display out there with a lot of great options. You can take an info card and find a place to connect with the people that may have the wisdom that you need, okay? Let me just highlight a couple of options, a couple of things we haven't talked about before. There's a group coming up called the Smart Step Family. It begins next Sunday, and that's going to run for 8 weeks. It's based on a video curriculum by one of the best read authors on blended families. His name is Ron Deal. And so if you're blessed with a blended family and you just want to have wisdom how to really thrive, this would be a great opportunity for you. I'll give you another one I'll highlight. It's called the Bible for Grown-Ups. And this will start the week of February 23rd. And this group will run for 6 weeks. And if you're new to Christianity or you're new to the Bible or trying to figure out the Bible, this is 6 weeks of talking about where the Bible came from and how to understand it in our culture today and how to read it and how to unpack it, how to interpret it, things like that. And that would be a great opportunity for you if you're not yet at the point where you feel comfortable reading the Bible on your own, because we encourage everybody to do that. So jump into a group not only for the wisdom that you'll gain from the content itself, but from the wisdom you can gain from the people around you as you begin to develop those relationships. Now, for some of you, you shouldn't be a part of a group. You should lead a group because you're one of those people that has some wisdom that you've accumulated over the years. You've been a Christian for a long time. You've grown in your faith, and it might be time for you to actually lead a group. And if that describes you, we'd love to have a conversation with you. Okay, so take advantage of those opportunities. As I wrap up, let me tell you a story not about the history of the nation of Israel, but that's a part of the history of our nation. And this story revolves around 2 different statues in Washington, D.C. that are 2.5 miles apart, but they tell a fascinating story. The first statue is this huge statue of General Ulysses S. Grant. It stands outside the Capitol building. It's a picture of him on a horse as if he's making his way off into battle. And as you may know, General Grant's leadership was the key to the Union victory in the Civil War. He was a great leader. He was a brilliant strategist. And then 2.5 miles away in a city park in Washington, D.C., there's another statue. It's a statue of this guy named John Rawlins, who was a major, a statue that most people never visit and a guy that most people have never even heard of. But John Rawlins was the chief of staff to General Grant. And these 2 men had known each other for years, and John Rawlins knew everything about General Grant, including his character deficiencies. And he knew that he had a propensity to drink too much. And so before the war started, he convinced General Grant to give up drinking until after the war was over. And whenever Grant would begin to feel the pressures of battle and the pressures of leadership, and when he would start drinking again, John Rawlins would come alongside him and he would encourage him and he would talk to him and he would get him back on track again. And I would suggest to you that it's very possible that the reason why our nation is still intact and why our unity as a nation was restored is because General Grant was willing to open up his life to a voice of wisdom. So here's my question for you. Who is the John Rawlins in your life? Who is that person? Who are those people that have permission to speak into your life and to give you encouragement and to give you wisdom when you need it? Okay, on your way out today, I just want to give you something to help you remember what we talked about today and apply it. So this is a mirror cling, and what you do is you take the back off of it, and then you put it on your mirror where you get ready every morning. There's no adhesive on the back; it's just static cling, so you can take it off again later. But we encourage you to put this on your mirror because we believe that your worst enemy is the person you see in the mirror every day. And so this is a picture of an owl, and an owl is a symbol of wisdom. So this is a reminder when you get up in the morning, that day, that week, to seek out wise counsel and to accept it and to allow it to change you. Okay, so you can take one of those on your way out. As I said last week, we're giving away a different one of these every week during this 4-week series. So you want to be here every week. This is a limited edition collector's set. And if you collect all 4 of these, you'll have all 4 of these, okay? So that's what you get for that, all right? So take one of those on your way out, investigate those group opportunities, and begin to intentionally surround yourself with those voices of wisdom that every single one of us needs in our lives. Why don't you go ahead and stand with me, and we'll pray, and then we'll let you go. God, it's been good to be here today to take a break from our routines and the busyness and the chaos of this world. And just to remember that you have a calling for us. You have a plan for our lives. You desire that we would make a difference in this world. And I pray that when we come to those moments of decision, those forks in the road, that we would turn, first of all, to you, but also to the people around us who we know could give us wise counsel, and then to listen to that and accept it, even if it's not what we want to hear, but it's what we need to hear. May we do that, so that we can be blessed, so that people around us can be blessed, and so that you can be glorified through our lives individually and collectively as a church. And I pray that in Christ's name. Amen. Hey, it's been great to have you guys here today. We'll see you next week for week number 3 of Your Own Worst Enemy. Have a great day and a great week.